Exactly 14 years and 4 days ago, on the 25th of December 2001, my father, Raymond Simonson, died suddenly of an unexpected heart attack, home in London. At that exact same time, I was at Limud Conference in the middle of giving a talk on British Jewish identity. When someone asked me recently what it is I miss most about my dad, I told them, apart from his legendary sense of humour, it was our conversations. I realised that in conversation was how we spent most of our time together. Whether in the car or over a meal or sitting next to each other at White Hart Lane watching our team play, we were always in conversation and our relationship centred around conversation. And when I think back to what most interests me about British Jewish identity, I realise it's conversation that interests me and concerns me. In fact, it's conversation that drives me. I believe that in order to ensure we have a vibrant, engaged, revitalised British Jewish community, we need to increase the quality, the variety, and the volume of Jewish conversation. So what do I mean, first of all, by quality? In the mid-90s, British Jewish philosopher Theodore Zeldin delivered a seminal series of talks live on BBC Radio 4 entitled Conversation, How Talk Can Change Your Life. In it, Zeldin defined real conversation as a meeting of minds, arguing that when minds meet, they don't just exchange facts, they transform them, reshape them, draw different implications from them, and exchange in new trains of thought. He then went on to give one of my favourite statements about the power of high-quality conversation, claiming conversation doesn't just reshuffle the cards, it creates new cards. Like Zeldin, I believe in the power of conversation to be transformational. However, in order for us to create new cards in the Jewish community, we need to increase the quality of much of the Jewish conversation within our community. At the very least, I believe we need to increase the quality of public Jewish discourse, especially when it comes to topics such as Israel or denominational differences, just as examples. For me, too often, Jewish conversation in the public domain is a bit too reminiscent of the arguments I witness in my children's school playground. It's a little bit too much who can shout the loudest or make the most ad hominem attacks. In fact, I'm always a little bit surprised not to hear a Jewish public debate end with that classic school playground rejoinder, my dad's bigger than your dad. To be frank, I find this lack of quality of public Jewish conversation to be embarrassing. Is it any wonder that so many of our bright young Jewish people are put off being engaged in their Jewish selves and in Jewish community life when this is their experience? Now, don't be mistaken for thinking that the high quality of Jewish conversations you've been experiencing this week at Limud or in the JDOV series reflects the norm. Of course, there are plenty of places where there's fantastic, meaningful, dynamic Jewish conversation. But in my opinion, the majority of Jewish conversation in the public domain, whether that's between Jews or about Jewish issues, too often it's of an inferior and I would argue damaging quality. So we need to increase the quality. And it's not just the quality of Jewish conversation we need to increase, it's the variety too. We need to widen the definition of what counts as a Jewish topic for conversation. In Pirkei Avot, chapter 5, Mishnah 22, we read in reference to the Torah, Ben Bagbag Omer, Hafach ba v'hafach ba l'chula ba. Ben Bagbag said, turn it and turn it, for everything is within it. The more we study our sources, the more we can understand that everything under the sun is contained within. Torah, Talmud, all the great works of the Jewish scholars and all our Jewish texts have something to say about every aspect of human existence. So it's important that we engage with and learn from all of it. To me, a natural conclusion to draw from this text is that if everything is contained within it, then every topic is ripe for Jewish conversation. So I've often thought that turn it, everything is in it would be a great slogan for Limud or for JDOV, the Jewish Community Centre I run, with topics on everything under the sun that act as starting points, multiple starting points for meaningful Jewish conversation. Now, I realise that all of this might seem completely obvious to most of you here, but it's pretty clear to me that Jewish public discourse is dominated by a very limited number of topics. From my experience, it's very rare to hear a conversation being played out in the Jewish media or in the world of politics, for example, on a Jewish topic that isn't either Israel or anti-Semitism or the Holocaust. And more troubling for me is that if you took a year's worth of front pages from the Jewish media in this country, what you would find is around 40 to 50% of those are around Israel, about 30 to 40% are some kind of negative, they're out to get us story, the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, what Jeremy Corbyn said today and why that we should be fearful of that. And all that leaves is what, 10, 20% of the rest. For the rest of Jewish life and learning and culture and community, for me, that's pretty depressing. Now, that's not to say, of course, that Israel and Holocaust and anti-Semitism are not important conversations. Of course they are. It's just that if you take Jewish life today and turn it, they're not the only things in it. And if we want the younger generations to grow up being passionate about being engaged with their Jewish selves and with Jewish community, we have to let them see and we have to encourage them that there are Jewish conversations, important Jewish conversations to be had on all manner of topics, from the EU and the Syrian refugee crisis, from the books of Philip Roth and Naomi Alderman, to the music of Achinoam Nini and Naomi Les and Irving Berlin, to everything under the sun. So, we need to increase the quality and the variety of Jewish conversation. But even if we succeed on both of these fronts, and we will, that won't be enough. There will be no Dayenu from me unless we complete the recipe by pumping up the Jewish volume. Now, of these three aspects, this is the one that most excites me and animates me. In Philip Roth's great novel, Deception, his American Jewish narrator in the UK observes, in England, whenever I'm in a public space, a restaurant, a party, the theatre, and someone happens to mention the word Jew, I notice that the voice just drops a little, even Jews. Now that chimes with my own experience as a child growing up, when I would see Jewish adults, when talking in public about certain topics, certain words, they would lower their voice. When talking about somebody that's got cancer, or when talking about a couple that are getting divorced, or even, embarrassingly, to say that somebody is Jewish. And I would hear that word be said, Jewish. And for me, it's quite upsetting as an adult to realise that that applies even to this day, that so many people, the word Jewish is a word to be whispered in public. This phenomenon of what I call the whispering Jews is something that was powerfully highlighted by British Jewish writer Naomi Alderman. I'm sure many of you have read her award-winning novel, Disobedience, set in North London's Jewish community. In one very powerful scene, the book's main character on it declares in exasperation, it's as though Jews in this country have made an investment in silence. There's a vicious circle here in which the Jewish fear of being noticed and the natural British reticence interact. They feed off each other so that British Jews cannot speak, cannot be seen, and value absolute invisibility over all other virtues. Don't get me wrong, I'm not going quite that far, and I don't fully agree with that, but there is something to say on its angry outburst that rings true, at least to a little bit for me. Now, that's not to say that I don't have some sympathy for this desire for many for invisibility and silence. Far from it. My mother, Danielle, was born in Nazi-occupied France towards the end of the Holocaust. Her grandparents, most of her aunts, uncles and cousins perished in Auschwitz. Her sister was hidden by nuns for a period, her elder sister. And in fact, my mother herself was hidden, along with my grandmother, in a false wall of a neighbour's apartment, where my grandmother's main role was to keep my mother silent and invisible whilst the SS raided the neighbourhood. By some miracle, my grandparents, my mother and her older sister managed to survive. And by the end of the war, they managed to flee to London to build a new life. Now, being Jewish and foreign in London at that time was not easy. And those two aspects of identity were not something that was advised to be very public about. So again, invisibility and silence were valued, and the volume of the Jewish conversation was dialed right down when outside of the home. Back to my late father, Mossi. He was born almost 20 years before my mother in London's East End. Now, the name Mossi in the East End of London in the 1920s was not an uncommon Jewish name. It took the classic biblical name Moshe and anglicised it a little bit, in much the same way as other popular names of the time, like Izzy or Solly, took the popular biblical names, Yitzchak and Shlomo, passed them through a British filter in order to just dial the Jewish volume down a little bit. By the time my father began his service in the Merchant Navy in World War II, he had experienced enough anti-Semitism to realise the best way for him to survive was also to put on that invisibility cloak. And how did he do it? He changed his name to Mick, a far from Jewish sounding name. Now, his family had already lost the original surname, which was Cohen, when his grandfather, Simon Cohen, fled pogroms in Russia at the turn of the century and arrived in England with his son, Isaac. Isaac was Simon's son, and his name became simply Isaac Simonson. So for the last 50 years of my father's life, he was just Mick Simonson. It was only during my early teens where I started hearing some of these stories about my parents' past and discovering my family's past. And at this same time, I started developing what I believe today is a very proud and strong Jewish identity. First, in my local Jewish youth club, thanks to some inspirational Jewish youth workers, then my gap year in Israel and through my student days, and now throughout my career. I've spent the best part of the last 3 decades engaged in the practice of dialing up the Jewish volume. I've rebelled against what Alderman's character Ronit called the Jewish fear of being noticed. Now, I get that both my parents had very good reason to fear being noticed Jewishly at key points in their life, but I don't. And in my opinion, despite what some people would have us to believe, the vast majority of British Jews don't either. So when I think again about what draws younger generations towards greater engagement in their Jewish selves and in Jewish community, and what pushes them away, I think this is a critical issue to resolve. For me, it's a problem of cognitive dissonance. The difference between, on the one hand, what we teach our young people about Jewish identity and pride, and on the other hand, what they witness and experience for themselves when they become Jewish adults. The British Jewish community invests millions of pounds every year in high-quality programs to engage young Jewish people, to increase their Jewish identity. Through the youth movements and the Jewish youth groups and the Zionist youth groups, thousands of Jewish children go to youth clubs and summer schemes. Every summer, for example, we send around 50% of all Jewish 16-year-olds to Israel to engage in a month-long Israel experience where they develop and explore their Jewish identity, where we encourage them to climb Masada to see the sunrise. We encourage them to kiss the Kotel, and we encourage them to go and buy T-shirts that say Coca-Cola in Hebrew and dance on the tabletop singing Am Yisrael Chai. And then when they're 18 or 19, they go on gap years to Israel, and we encourage them to do that. And again, we encourage them to explore their Jewish identity, to get involved in volunteering, to wear all sorts of T-shirts with Hebrew slogans on them, and to dance on the tabletop singing Am Yisrael Chai. And in any given year, there are around 8,000 British Jewish students at universities across the UK. And we invest a lot of time and money in supporting UJS in the phenomenal work they do to encourage Jewish students to be out of the Jewish closet, to be out loud and proud, to defeat the anti-Semites on campus, to stand up against those who would bash Israel, and to wear their big sweatshirts that say Jew across the front. And you've guessed it, to dance on the tabletop singing Am Yisrael Chai. But then what happens? They reach what, 22, 23, they leave the bubble of the youth movement and UJS, and they enter the adult world of the Jewish community. And what's the first thing they notice? There are very few adults dancing on the tabletops, singing Am Yisrael Chai. Not in public at least, maybe at Limud. This Jewish pride, which they had been encouraged by us, the adult Jewish community, to develop and to show proudly their Jewish identity throughout all of these years, suddenly they can't quite see it everywhere. It's harder to find. And even more so, and I've heard this from young adults, they realise that many Jewish adults in this community are embarrassed by the sight of those Jews who are out most visibly from the Jewish closet, who are most noticeably Jewish, the Haredim. I think people find them just a little bit too Jewy in public. Now, don't get me wrong, there are, of course, pockets and moments of mainstream British Jewry coming out of the Jewish closet and dialing up the volume to 11. Jewish Book Week, the UK Jewish Film Festival, Limud, all fantastic examples of annual festivals of Jewish learning, Jewish life, and Jewish culture, where they increase the quality, the variety, and the volume of Jewish conversation. But I want to see the vibrant and noisy spirit of Limud overflowing into the streets year-round, not just concentrated for 1 week a year in the bubble of a conference centre in Birmingham. A few weeks ago, 5,000 Jews gathered in Trafalgar Square in London for the annual celebration of Hanukkah. We stood there in the most British of landmarks, right, at the foot of Nelson's Column, opposite the National Gallery, next to a 20-metre high Christmas tree, and there was this outpouring, one of the greatest expressions I've seen of when we dial the volume up really loud in public. A joyous display of Jewish pride and identification. And I have to tell you, that's why Hanukkah has fast become one of my favourite times of the year. I love going around and seeing those great displays of Jewish pride lit up against the dark night skies. And I hope that every Jew that sees them, it engenders in them a sense of pride. And for those whispering Jews, I hope it encourages them to step out of the closet and to dial the volume up just a little bit. But I want to see this all year round and not just for 1 week of the year. That's why I do the job that I do. That's what keeps me awake at night, and that's what gets me up in the morning. So, I am driven by my family's past, by my past and my family's experiences. They've shaped who I am. When my first child was born, about 8 years ago, I had the chance to bring this conversation round full circle. My incredibly wise wife, Helene, and I had deep conversations about the importance of the name we give our son. And when we knew we were having a son, my wife said, we need to call him Mossy. Now, I never disagree with anything my wife suggests, so that's what we called him, Mossy Simonson. And it's not just in the hope that he will inherit some of the many qualities and values that my father had. It's also as a way to go back to that proud Jewish lineage, to connect him already with Jewish pride that name for me evokes, and to ensure that the next generation of our family starts life with the Jewish volume dialed right up. So, to finish, my blessing for my children and for yours is that they may live a life filled with Jewish conversations that are consistently high in quality, wide in variety, and loud in volume. Thank you.